Now I call for order. There we got it. All right. For decades, it's been the policy of the United States to see the countries of Europe and Eurasia increase their liberty. That's been our goal, to find security from hostile foreign coercion and to grow into their economic prosperity. To achieve this, we have deployed men and women in uniform. We have deployed our tax dollars abroad into these areas for decades, and we were resolved that a more secure and peaceful Europe would be increased and that they would increase our own security here at home in the United States. This afternoon's hearing is to examine the path that has been laid out by President Trump, Secretary of State Pompeo, and Administrator Green for U.S. policy towards Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. What are aims and goals, and what are the aims and goals that we have as a country in that region, that is, and what advantage we can leverage, and what part of the burden from what we do in that area can be borne by our allies themselves, and how are the resources our government has been putting in to that region, how does it match up to the achievements that we've been having in that region. Earlier this year, when the administration unveiled the first fiscal year 2019 budget proposal, the international affairs portion amounted to roughly $42 billion. That was a sizable top-line decrease and contained major reductions for assistance programs and activities inside the region that this subcommittee oversees. Now, before we get into this any further, I know some of my colleagues will point out that the international affairs portion of the budget is relatively small, implying that waste or unneeded spending must also be small if we have a small budget. Well, I totally reject that notion. Our government, and hence the American people, are over $1 trillion, that's $21 trillion in debt. Every dollar that we vote to spend places even a heavier burden on either the taxpayers today or our children, who will eventually pay the bill. We need to ensure that they are getting every ounce of value that is in any budget that we propose. From our witnesses today, I look forward to learning about the programming in their areas of responsibility and how much of those efforts cost and how much they cost and how they are furthering the president's agenda and his stated vision to build a stabler partner in the states and there in the region, and to counter radical Islamic terrorism in Europe and Eurasia. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today, and all members will have 5 days to submit material for the record. And we will be introducing the witnesses in a moment. And what I'm going to do is ask you to keep your testimony down to about 5 minutes. Anything else you want to put in the record, it will be in the record. And then we will go to one question and answer period once you are all done with your testimony. So I'll now yield to my ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for his opening remarks. After that, I will introduce our witnesses and ask them, as I say, to summarize their testimony.
Other members of the subcommittee make okay?
If there is a request, the answer is yes. Okay, got it. But if we could, Mr. Meeks, being the ranking member, we have 5 minutes, but if I could ask my other colleagues to make it about 2 minutes, is that okay? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, because the U.S.-Europe-Eurasia relationship remains an important part of global stability in light of efforts by Russia to interfere in our democracies. The Trump administration has proposed a total fiscal year 19 budget request for Europe and Eurasia that is at $424.2 million, a decline of 63% from actual funding for 2017. The funding of that time was $1.1 billion. I'm concerned about this and want to get an understanding from our witnesses today about how this aligns and how it impacts U.S. interests. The proposed budget calls into question whether or not the State Department will be adequately resourced in Europe and Central Asia at a time when there is an acute need to support our allies and advance U.S. priorities. The Trump administration's fiscal year 19 budget leads us to question the ability of USAID and the State Department to execute their missions in the face of the Russian malign influence and the draconian cuts proposed by the President of the United States. Enshrined both within both the USAID and the State Department's mission statements is a commitment to promote democratic values abroad, advance a free, peaceful, and prosperous world, foster conditions for stability and progress for the benefit of the American people and people everywhere. And yet, we hear that some USAID missions in Europe are closing completely, and resources are being diverted away from USAID and the State Department. And instead, those resources are headed one place, to the Pentagon, not back to the American people, not to say, not going to make a difference with reference to the debt, but going to the Pentagon. So in short, because my time is short, and I won't quote all of the decorated American generals who time and time again say a weakened diplomatic corps directly undermines our national security. I cannot understand how the American people are served by a diminished diplomatic community. What I see here plainly by examining this budget is a mismatch of priorities and lack of strategy to support our interests and needs. Today, some leaders in Europe are leaning toward authoritarianism and are not safeguarding the democratic principles the EU and NATO were founded upon. We see tactics like cracking down on free speech, attacking the media, shutting down opposition, and weakening of judiciaries. In Poland, we see the backsliding of strong democratic institutions with actions that undermine the pillars of democracy. I've spoken out, for example, about the termination of judges based on their failure to agree with the ruling party. We know of the disciplining of judges for not ruling against the ruling party. Independent media censored and placed in the hands of state affiliates. Raids of NGOs and terminated funding based on whether the government disapproves of the community served by the NGO. With regards to Hungary, on September 12th, the European Parliament voted to censure Hungary, and lawmakers denounced Viktor Orban's government as a systemic threat to the rule of law. This underscores that we must work with our allies to bolster, not undercut, the very values that provide the basis for the United States partnerships with local governments and their institutions. We have seen the Kremlin's aggressive efforts to destabilize semi-consolidated democracies and transitional governments like Ukraine, Georgia, Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Consolidated democracies are not isolated from the same Kremlin aggressions. Baltic and Nordic states, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, are all contending with Russia's anti-democratic efforts. I do not understand how the administration's proposed budget addresses our shared security objectives and prosperity. And I hope to hear from our witnesses today how this budget addresses our challenges and prepares us for our challenges of tomorrow. I'll close with just that I just had lunch with several former prime ministers in the Eastern Europe, all very concerned, all allies, strong allies of ours, all who, even pay their 2% to NATO, seriously concerned about what's taking place in regards to this budget, and so I'd love to hear from you in that regards, and I yield back.
Mr. Sherman.
I want to associate myself with Mr. Meeks's comments about how we need to be spending an adequate amount and more than is put forward in the President's budget on foreign aid in general and the region we're here to discuss. One of the many reasons, advantages of spending money in foreign aid is we can then go to European countries and push them to do more, pointing out that the United States bears the great burden of world national security, that when in the region we're here to talk about, there was mass atrocities in Kosovo and Bosnia, the United States did the lion's share of the national security and military effort to save people from ethnic cleansing and some would say genocide. And so I'll want to know from our witnesses what is being done by the State Department to push Europe to do more. This is especially clear because we're asking Europe to do more in Europe. So the right comparison is not between what we do in Europe and what Europe does in Europe, but what we do in Europe versus what we do in the Americas and what Europe does in Europe. And I don't think that Europe does very much to deal with the great problems of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and the Caribbean. I'll also be asking our witnesses about the Caucasus, particularly the newly renamed Republic of Artsakh, what efforts you can make to get Treasury to focus on a tax treaty for Armenia, and while it's outside the purview of the subcommittee, I will sneak in a question for Ms. Puma about Sindh and Pakistan, because I know that that is in your area, and my colleagues will forgive me for asking a question on that. I yield back.
And Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today on foreign assistance budget requests for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. I was disappointed to see the President's request of foreign assistance for this region represent a 28% decrease from the fiscal year 2018 funding levels. Countries like Ukraine and Georgia, which have experienced direct conflict with Russia, are subject to substantial cuts. Georgia, in particular, would be subject to a 25% cut in funding. These cuts are not a return to average. They would fall far below the average for the past 10 years. Many countries in Europe and Central Asia are at pivotal moments to either open their governments to democracy or retreat into autocratic tendencies. The United States should not step back from engaging and pushing countries to adopt open markets and good government practices. Now is the time to invest in the long-term benefits of a stable and prosperous Europe and Central Asia. Thank you to the witnesses today on their work in Europe and Central Asia, and I want to thank you all for your hard work that you bring positive change to the region. I yield back.
And thank you to our members who've shown up. This is a discussion and not just testimony and not just back and forth. We're going to have, and we appreciate that we have some great witnesses to help us lead this discussion. Brock Bierman is the Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. Before coming to his current position, Mr. Bierman served in multiple capacities with FEMA and Usaid and the Department of Interior and in the private sector as well. And Janine Nguyen is the Acting Coordinator for the Office of Assistance Coordination for Europe. There you are, okay. For Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. Ms. Nguyen is also the Director of the Office of Policy and Global Issues inside the Bureau of European Eurasian Affairs. She is a senior civil servant with a long track record within the executive branch. And then we have Anne-Marie Wedislak. I mispronounce it every time. There we go. But that's okay. My name's Rohrbacher, and everybody mispronounces that. So, and she's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and currently serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Asia within Usaid. And prior to joining the Asia Bureau, she served as the Deputy Mission Director of the regional Usaid office covering Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and Cyprus. And Amelia Puma, there you are, is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of South and Central Asia. She is also a career member of the Senior Foreign Policy Service. Since joining the State Department in 1991, she has held a wide range of posts, including assignments in Spain, Kosovo, and Italy, among others. So we have some real pros with us today, and I want to thank you for sharing your experience with us and your judgment. And if you could do that for, as I say, for 5 minutes, that'll be helpful, and then we will have a discussion, a dialogue. Ms. Wynn, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today on the President's FY19 budget request for Europe and Eurasia. I deeply appreciate your interest, commitment, and strong bipartisan support for our region and the work we are doing to protect our national interests. I would ask that you please submit my written testimony for the record. As reflected in the President's national security strategy, the principal goal of U.S. engagement with Europe is to preserve the West as a community of nations united by shared sacrifice and a commitment to common defense, democratic values, fair trade, and shared interests. While making America more prosperous and secure is work that starts at home, preserving the West cannot happen without our allies and partners in Europe. A strong and free Europe is vital to American interests. The President's FY19 foreign assistance request of $424.2 million for Europe and Eurasia supports the President's priority of enhancing the safety and security of the American people, which includes advancing our vision of a Europe that is strong and free. To this end, we will pursue 6 main goals. First, we will strive to strengthen the Western alliance and compete effectively for positive influence by working with our NATO allies to ensure that the alliance is ready and willing to defend itself. Second, we will strengthen and balance the transatlantic trade and investment relationship between the United States and Europe. The President's FY19 foreign assistance request supports this goal with over $117 million in economic growth assistance. With these funds, we will establish a level playing field that allows American companies to compete and create jobs and strengthen the energy security of our European allies and partners. Third, we must secure the eastern frontier of Europe, where Russia and others increasingly seek to sow and exploit division, destabilize Europe, and weaken Western cohesion. Our foreign assistance request reflects these priorities, with over $252 million going toward supporting the frontline states of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, where Russia's aggression and pressure are the greatest, and nearly $78 million to support stability in the Western Balkans and advance their Western integration. Ukraine is engaged in an internal struggle to implement a broad range of economic, anti-corruption, judicial, and governance reforms, even as it faces continued Russian aggression and pressure. Our FY19 foreign assistance request of $204 million for Ukraine is a tangible sign of our steadfast resolve to stand with the Ukrainians and their democratic aspirations. While the government has put in place many considerable reforms over the last 4 years, it still has much to do, including implementing anti-corruption laws, adjusting gas tariffs, and reducing budget deficits in line with IMF requirements, and ensuring upcoming elections are free and fair. We remain committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity, and since 2014, we have provided over $1 billion in training and equipment to Ukraine to help it defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to better monitor and secure its borders, and to deploy its forces more safely and effectively. Our FY19 request continues to support these aims, including $20 million in foreign military financing assistance. In Georgia, we have a steadfast partner whose efforts to reform are one of the good news stories in a tough neighborhood. Our FY19 assistance request of just over $31 million will continue to help Georgia counter Russian aggression by diversifying its economy and fostering a business environment that is grounded in rule of law and friendly to American businesses. Our continuing support to our Western Balkans partners prioritizes advancing the normalization of Kosovo-Serbia relations and their integration into the Western community of nations. We will continue to facilitate political reform and reconciliation in Bosnia and Herzegovina and work with Greece and Macedonia to implement the Prespa Agreement, resolving the name dispute and so unblock the path to Macedonia's Euro-Atlantic integration. And we will keep working with partners to enhance the region's capabilities to fight organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. Finally, securing Europe's eastern frontier also means supporting the democratic aspirations of the people of Armenia, including preserving their freedom to choose further integration with the West. Our fourth strategic goal is to work with allies, the EU, and partners to stabilize the southern frontier, where recent migration flows have sent ripples through the heart of Europe, even as Russian competition in the Eastern Med is increasing. Fifth, we will uphold Western democratic principles and institutions, which are key to our security and prosperity. In line with this goal, our FY 2019 foreign assistance requests includes over $150 million to support democracy and governance reforms in the region. Finally, our success in achieving all of these goals will depend heavily on maintaining the confidence of the American people who have entrusted the Department of State and USAID with their taxpayer dollars in support of our national security objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Puma?
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss the administration's FY 2019 budget request for Central Asia. I've submitted prepared remarks for the record as well. Today, my testimony will cover our requests for Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Turkmenistan. I want to begin by extending my heartfelt sympathies to the families of the 2 American citizens killed in Tajikistan in a senseless terrorism act last July. We stand with those families and are working closely with Tajik authorities in the ongoing investigation. Both victims were brave individuals who represented the best of America. The administration recognizes the critical role Central Asia plays in the world economy and political system. Neighboring Russia, China, Iran, and Afghanistan, these 5 proud nations have sought to maintain their sovereignty by navigating a quickly changing political landscape. Central Asia is experiencing a period of profound transformation. Depressed petroleum prices have increased the demand to diversify their economies. We continue to dedicate resources to building the region's hydropower potential, linking surplus hydropower resources in Tajikistan and the Kyrgyz Republic with the energy-hungry markets of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Political transitions are also underway. We are encouraged by the bold reforms championed by the President of Uzbekistan in economic development, rule of law, and human rights. Through his leadership, Uzbekistan is pursuing a neighbors first strategy, seeking to put an end to decades-old border disputes. We appreciate Uzbekistan's desire to support an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned negotiation to bring the war to a close, and we continue to explore ways to work with Uzbekistan to help them achieve these goals. For FY 2019, the department requests $66.3 million for Central Asia. This includes $15.5 million for Tajikistan, the country in greatest need of development assistance, bordering Afghanistan and China. Assistance increases stability and economic growth, supports food security, and combats the spread of multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. This also includes $10.6 million for Uzbekistan in support of their reform agenda, including justice sector reforms, sustainable employment, and economic reforms. Assistance will likewise combat transnational crime, including narcotics and trafficking in persons. For the Kyrgyz Republic, the administration requests $10.5 million to accelerate their economic growth. Assistance will also promote stability, regional security, civil society, human rights, and the rule of law. For Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, the administration requests $1.7 million and $0.4 million, respectively, to support their export controls and related border security, as well as military-to-military training. Finally, the administration requests $27.5 million in regional funding for Central Asia to support efforts in economic connectivity, democracy and governance, stability and security, and to counter violent extremism. Funding would also address the spread of HIV/AIDS and support the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Central Asia is a vital element of our South Asia strategy and our efforts to create a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Afghanistan. But Central Asia itself is a welcoming, culturally rich land of enormous economic potential. We welcome the subcommittee's review of our FY 2019 budget request and look forward to working together to support this region. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Bierman.
Chairman Rob Barker and Ranking Member Meeks, on behalf of the U.S. Agency for International Development, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you to be able to testify today, and I would ask that my written remarks be included for the record. I'd like to start off by paraphrasing the great observer of democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, who noted that true friends of liberty must remain constantly vigilant and ready. As I will outline in my remarks, USAID remains vigilant and ready to assist our partners in Europe and Eurasia. Before I go into more detail, I would like to highlight 3 points from my confirmation hearing last November. First, I spoke about the challenges of countering Kremlin-aligned influence, and I will speak about that later. Second, I committed to focusing on youth programs and how we will build the next generation of leaders in our region. This commitment is coming to fruition through our European Democracy Youth Network, now known as EDEN. Democracy demands a commitment from every generation to public service and the willingness to enter into dialogue with those who hold opposing views. The EDEN program will build a network of youth leadership across the region that will do exactly that. And third, I committed to strengthening communications with Congress, and over the last several months, we have had high-level engagements, including conversations with both you and your staff, and I look forward to continuing this effort and deepening our relationship. Mr. Chairman, over the past 2.5 decades, the countries of E&E have made incredible strides. Half of our region partner countries have graduated from USAID assistance and joined institutions such as Nato and the European Union. They are all now close allies and key trading partners of the United States. USAID is proud of the role and its profound transformation in this process. In response to the progress, the Kremlin is stepping up efforts to undermine the gains. And for example, let me just give you a couple examples. Frustrated farmers in northern Azerbaijan have personally told me that Russia frequently manipulates and restricts water supplies. And in July, Russia prevented truckloads of fresh apricots from crossing the border, wiping out farmers' entire livelihoods. And last year, Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine infected 60 countries worldwide, causing billions of dollars of damage. Thus, while this budget is fiscally conservative, USAID stands vigilant and ready to achieve our U.S. foreign policy objectives by helping these countries consolidate democratic progress, increasing their economic integration to the West. And so now let me cover the region. Ukraine continues to struggle with numerous fundamental challenges, particularly in the intense political, economic, and military pressure from Russia. Our assistance helps Ukraine to resist these pressures on its chosen path toward prosperity, democracy, and closer ties with the West. In particular, we continue to focus on reducing corruption, fostering much-needed decentralization, and spurring economic community development in conflicted areas in eastern Ukraine. Now turning to Georgia, the request supports U.S. foreign policy objectives within the country by resisting malign Kremlin influence, further consolidating democratic and economic gains, and enhancing energy security. Specifically, we are building on gains of increasing dynamic economy by promoting competitiveness and export potential. And at the same time, we are strengthening civil society to enhance rule of law by supporting a fourth wave of judicial reform. Now moving on to Moldova, the request will support independent media, strengthening democratic institutions, and build more competitive economy integrating into Europe, and diversify its energy supply. I must also note of the recent mayoral election in Chisinau, which was unfairly annulled, and is a warning sign of backsliding in the region. Thus, we will be carefully watching Moldova's democratic process before and after the parliamentary elections in February. Turning to the Western Balkans, USAID programs address the challenging and fragile institutions, weak growth and rule of law, endemic corruption, and limited media freedoms, in addition to responding to the issues of violent extremism, increased Russian influence in the region. And next, I would just like to note 2 hopeful cases. In just a few days, Macedonia will vote on a referendum which will clear the way for progress into NATO and the EU. USAID is working with the State Election Commission to ensure integrity of this referendum. In Armenia, Thanks to democratic breakthroughs this past spring, when citizens peacefully gathered to demand political change, the new government appears committed to reforms, and USA will harness this momentum in Armenia by encouraging the civic engagement of newly mobilized citizens and providing targeted assistance to the government and civil society organizations. Next, I want to also note some changes taking place at USAID and how they will benefit the region. The agency's new transformation initiative titled Journey to Self-Reliance will create conditions for partner countries to lead, finance, and implement their own development agendas. Key aspects include fostering democratic resources, key democratic resource base to sustain development, and expanding engagement in collaborative design with private sector. Mr. Chairman, before concluding, I would like to take this opportunity to tell you a bit about our Countering Kremlin Influence development framework. This framework will guide our programming to help countries withstand the Kremlin's interference. Priorities include strengthening democratic institutions, the rule of law, expanding independent media, combating corruption, increasing energy security, diversifying the economic sector, and advancing integration with the West. And finally, by noting that although the countries in the region boast many development achievements and successes, much remains to be done. Many of those successes, while impressive, are partial and subject to reversal. This budget request ensures USAID's vigilance and readiness to build a more democratic and prosperous Europe and Eurasia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to see if I can pronounce your name now. Let's see. Anne-Marie Wastisiak. That's as good as I'm going to do tonight. All right. Well, thank you very much. I have mispronounced her name every time she comes. She always has the best testimony, so it's good. You may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, and Representative Sherman, thank you for inviting me to testify on USAID's role in advancing U.S. foreign policy priorities in Central Asia. I ask that my testimony also be included for the record. USAID's fiscal year 2019 request of $48.3 million supports our bilateral efforts in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the Kyrgyz Republic, as well as for the Central Asia regional programs covering all 5 countries. With FY 2019 funds, USAID will strengthen democratic institutions, focusing on improving governance, amplifying the voice of civil society, advancing rule of law, and supporting the independence of media. In economic governance, USAID will create a legal enabling environment for competitiveness, enhance trade facilitation, and promote responsible infrastructure development, including transforming the energy sector, while encouraging U.S. private sector investment. Enhanced energy and trade within Central Asia promotes greater integration and reduces these countries' dependence on Russia and China. USAID's programs are a critical component of the administration's South Asia strategy by advancing regional stability, promoting partnerships between South and Central Asia, particularly Afghanistan, and supporting the sovereignty and regional connectivity of the Central Asian countries. Accordingly, we will prioritize building local capacity in Central Asia, engaging the private sector in the growth process, and helping partner countries mobilize domestic and international resources to fund their own development agendas, which will move them forward on their journey to self-reliance. In Uzbekistan, USAID is leveraging strategic openings, working to strengthen civil society and the rule of law, expand trade and energy cooperation, and strengthen health outcomes. For example, by digitizing the case management and civil courts nationwide, USAID has helped the Uzbek courts cut the average length of cases in half. Earlier this year, USAID and Uzbekistan signed 4 MOUs to enhance our cooperation in rule of law, trade, energy, and to assist the country accede to the World Trade Organization. With 2019 resources, USAID will help Uzbekistan open its economy, fight corruption, and improve the business climate for U.S. companies. U.S. technology and products introduced over the last 2 years have resulted in Uzbek companies purchasing everything from John Deere tractors to 600,000 walnut saplings from California nurseries. In health, USAID assistance helped reduce tuberculosis incidence in the country by 44% from 2001 to 2016 and helped decrease TB mortality by almost 80% in the same time period. In the Kyrgyz Republic, USAID will use 2019 resources to boost private sector competitiveness and build on our successful efforts in health and education. USAID is also working to strengthen the financial sustainability of local media outlets. In education, we've improved the reading skills of 65% of public school primary students, and at the government's request, have expanded our reading interventions to every public primary school in the country. In Tajikistan, USAID will use the 2019 resources to continue to foster inclusive development and reduce malnutrition. New technologies introduced by USAID have quadrupled high-value fruit and vegetable production and sourced about 50 crop varieties from California. These efforts have helped reduce stunting from 31% to 18% over the last 5 years. In health, the first patients treated with the new U.S. drug are completely cured of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis when once the disease was vitally fatal. Lastly, USAID will use 2019 resources to engage and bring together the 5 Central Asian countries, including through the U.S.-sponsored C5+1 initiative, to promote cooperation in trade, energy, and water, as well as to improve conditions for labor migrants, reducing their vulnerability to radicalization. Our budget request will also enable USAID to help establish a market-based Central Asia regional electricity market. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your support of USAID's programs in Central Asia. Investing in Central Asia's development remains in our national interest. With our fiscal year 2019 budget request, we are committed to making the most out of every taxpayer dollar to ensure that our partner countries move forward on their journeys to self-reliance and we achieve the objectives of the South Asia Strategy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. And I am going to let Mr. Meeks lead off with the questions today. And Mr. Meeks, you may proceed.
That means he wants to do something else behind me. No, I'm kidding. Thank you for your testimony. And I think that it's tremendously important what you've indicated. And so I ask each and every one of you, you all agree that the work that you do, whether it's USAID, whether it's the State Department, is tremendously important for the people of the United States of America. Is that correct? Everybody. And it's been helpful. I mean, we have seen meaningful results as a result of the diplomatic work that you do on the ground on a continuous basis. In fact, as a number of generals have indicated in the past, it may have even saved lives in the long run. Would you all concur to that? Now, my concern is because I think that in the past, when I look at the severe cuts that are going to take place here, you know, at the level that they are, I don't think, unless you tell me otherwise, that either the State Department or USAID running the programs that you've ran just was foolishly spending money and not looking at and trying to evaluate the programs of which you were in charge of, and working very closely with some of our allies in some of the countries in Europe and Eurasia, and counteracting other countries who may not have the same rules and values that we have. Is that also correct? Yeah? Okay. So then with this proposed budget, if it was to be enacted, I'll start, what adjustments would USAID, let's start with that, Mr. Bierman, have to make in order to sustain the current efforts so that we can continue to do what you're doing with the draconian cuts, you know, that we see 28% overall, and we see how certain countries in Eastern Europe being cut, you know, some, you know, 63%. What do you do?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, and I appreciate the opportunity answer your question. I also would just state quickly that we will remain available to answer questions after this through the QFRs, and also to meet with you personally to go over every single one of your questions that we might not have time for today. As over the last 8 months, I have made a high priority of coming up to Congress and meeting with members and their staffs to answer these very important questions. But let me just say that I think that the President's request does give us the resources we need to accomplish our goals. I would also suggest to you that we've been very strategic in our efforts, and we've been very focused. We've been putting together a strategic framework in terms of countering Kremlin influence, and we are specifically going after those areas that are of most need with both of our host countries and also the region. Finally, I would also suggest to you that we are working with our European counterparts to be more collaborative and strategic in our work. We're working with the private sector in terms of bringing more resources to the table, and we're also working, and I think this is important, with diaspora. I've made it a personal priority to make sure that I meet with diaspora and I talk to them about how we can bring additional resources to the table to help solve some of the issues that we're facing. And finally, I just wanted to let you know that in Europe and Eurasia, we are not closing any missions. We are looking at a country office in Albania where we are looking at the relationship as it currently stands, but there is no plans right now to close any of our missions or our country offices, and we will be happy to work with Congress consult with Congress as we reassess our host country's path to their self-reliance.
So let me just ask this then, because what I'm trying to make sure that maybe then we don't need to make the errors of the past. Are you saying to me that the money that you had previously, you were overfunded in the past?
I would say that we are utilizing the resources from Congress in a very strategic
Right.
and positive manner.
So you're just doing what you have to do because that's all the money you're going to get if this budget is enacted. Is that correct?
I think we're being much more strategic in our focus. And we're also being more effective.
So then we should have been more
respect the fact-
strategic in the past. We didn't need to give the money. Because I want to make sure we don't do that. If you didn't need the money before, and and if we're just going to accept that the budget is, we get cut, and there's no advocacy, because in the past when I was in these hearings, no matter who the president was, whether it was Obama or Bush, the urge was to fight for as much dollars to create and have the kinds of programs that are necessary on the ground, so which would benefit the interests of the American people. Now, if I'm hearing now that there has been a concrete examination of the funds that was received in the past within the agency, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, so I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to even ask you to answer the question. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to answer the question. But I just want you to know that I appreciate very much the work that USAID has been doing on behalf of the American people. And I think that in your statement, you indicated that there has been progress, but there are several countries that are still under the threat of Russia influence, and some of that is increasing. Is that correct? It hasn't decreased. It's still there.
No, it is creating a clear choice between authoritarianism and open democracy.
And Ms. Yadashak, at the State Department, it's the same issue. I mean, the same questions. I mean, the work that you do is valuable to the American people and make a difference on the ground to people, to the American citizens. So they've been getting, because when I look at what our foreign aid is over our overall budget, it's less than 1%. So the American people have been getting a good value out of their dollar investing in our State Department and USAID and the regions, what we're talking about now, whether it's Europe or Central Asia. The American people haven't been shortchanged by the money that we've been giving to the State Department, have they?
I am with USAID. So
USAID, okay,
refer
I'm sorry.
to my state colleagues.
Who's
to
here from the
answer.
State Department? State to Ms. Nguyen and Ms. Puma. I'm sorry.
I'll answer the question first. Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. First, before I answer the question, I want to say thank you to the members of Congress for the generous support that you have provided both the career members of the service and the department and USAID in supporting the foreign policy objectives for our region. I guess I would answer your question in the following way. We recognize that as we sit here, we understand that the budget resources to support our foreign policy objectives are just one part of the greater whole, and that you all have a very tough job in balancing the priorities for our foreign policy objectives against domestic policy objectives and the very real deficits that face us. So what the President's request for FY19 is it is a request of fiscal restraint. Within that request, and I think this is what Brock was trying to get at, is that we are trying to be very strategic within this request. We're trying to be very responsible in making sure that the resources that we have are being put towards our highest priorities. And for us, within the State Department and USAID, for Europe and Eurasia, that priority is focusing on those states that are on the front lines of Russian aggression. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, where there are Russian boots on the ground, and also more vulnerable areas in the Western Balkans, which are also susceptible to malign influence. Within that, we're also being strategic about the types of assistance and engagement and interventions that we're using, so that we're focusing on those levers and influences that are of biggest challenge. First and foremost, supporting our partners and allies in strengthening their cyber defenses, especially as it relates to their election systems. Supporting local efforts to counter disinformation, which serves to discredit our democracies and sow division within the West. Focusing on the fight against corruption, which really is the door to malign influence from Russia, but also increasingly from China. And finally, supporting our European partners as they strengthen their energy security. Again, with the resources that
one
we
thing,
have,
and I know
we want to be
I've
strategic.
gone over my time, but so what will you now not focus on?
So we're focusing, what we're not focusing on are
Right.
those areas.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we'll not be focusing on those areas that don't align with those goals. So again, prioritizing where the threat's greatest, in those areas where the vulnerabilities are greatest, and finally working in partnership with our European donors and even with the private sector to make sure that we're leveraging as much of the outside resources as we can to address these threats.
Right. I'll just close with saying that I know that if you reprioritizing, there's something that you've got to leave out. And from prior testimony under various administrations, they talked about the work that they did. All of it was substantial. And now you have to make choices. And so a lot of things have to be left out. And when I see where these dollars are going, it's not like the dollars are going into a savings account. The dollars are going into the military. That's where it's going. And so it just seems to me then we're reshifting completely from the diplomatic side, or cutting the diplomatic side, into just the military side, causing an imbalance that we once were trying to fix. Because from the generals that I've talked to, they say we need both. And one general, the favorite quote, the cuts that we take away from diplomacy, we got to add it for bullets. And that's just my point. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Meeks. I have a few questions of my own, but let me note that we are spending $833 billion more this year than we are taking in. So every cent that we spend overseas is being paid for by our grandchildren. And
You passed the tax cut.
the tax cut is probably going to,
A lot of money there.
may end up with actually more revenue because the level of economic activity here will be increased. It's okay. Let me just note that that type of deficit spending has to be dealt with in some way, and one way will be to increase the productivity of our economy. The other way will have to be trying to make sure that we have a greater sense of responsibility in every dollar that's being spent, especially outside of our country, especially for hopefully the benefit of other countries that is of mutual benefit to us. I understand the argument that helping other people is of benefit to us if it creates stability, et cetera. But should we actually be financing, well, first of all, let me ask about the crops in Ukraine. Now, who was it who mentioned that we have doubled certain crops in Ukraine? Was it you, Mr. Berman, or? All right. Yeah, could you go into that detail a little bit for that? How did we, what crops were doubled, and how did we do that? And
Actually, I believe in Uzbekistan, where we have
yes,
been
it says
working.
Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan. We've been working with the private sector as well as the local farmers on increasing the horticulture
How did we do that?
through a contract and through a contractor, and then we actually helped with leveraging private sector investment to connect them to California to bring in the walnut saplings.
So was, was an American company we contracted with to go there and help their farmers produce more of their product? Is that what happened?
We did. We brought in American experts and farmers to be able to increase the yields in the horticulture
Do you know
sector.
what crops those were?
They were walnut saplings, if I'm not mistaken.
Walnuts?
Walnuts
Okay.
that were brought in from California.
All right, that's interesting. We have, and how much did it cost us to double the walnut production in Uzbekistan?
That's a number I'd have to get back to you on, Mr. Chairman. I'm not exactly
Thank you.
sure.
And I certainly don't expect you to have that at the top of your head, but if you could get back to me, that would be very
Sure.
nice. I guess what we need to know is every time we have an expenditure, whether it's to increase the walnuts in Uzbekistan or whatever it is, we need to now show in the age that we're in exactly how this is going to have an impact, a positive impact on the United States, because we are borrowing that money from our grandchildren. And that, of course, Uzbekistan is a vitally important country. There's no doubt about it. I think one of the most important things that we have to deal with, one of the most vital things, is the stability of Central Asia, in the sense that if Central Asia stays stable from the expansion of radical Islam, the whole world will be better off, especially the Western world will be better off. If indeed radical Islam permeates into Central Asia, the instability that creates will be incredibly damaging to the stability of the entire planet. So there is a importance there, and maybe walnut production in Uzbekistan may be part of that. But we have to make sure that we can argue that case and that we know about that. Now, what about the money that we're spending in governments that are democratically elected, and like in Hungary, and yet we are spending certain amounts of money for what we call reformists or groups that are involved with their democratic process. Is this something that we can still afford to do? I mean, we have already a democratically elected government, and we go in and are supporting various people who are pushing for various what we consider to be fundamental aspects of our society, but maybe not necessarily fundamental to their culture. And can we still afford to do that? And why should we do that if they already have a democratically elected government? Anybody want to answer that? Ms. Wynn?
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. I'll try to answer that as best I can.
Talk a little louder so we can all hear you.
Sorry. I'll try to answer that as best I can. We share with our NATO allies and EU member states, including Hungary, some enduring principles and shared values, and we expect our allies and principles to uphold them. Part of what the source of American strength is that wherever we are throughout the globe, we stand for fundamental freedoms and democratic principles. We'll continue to engage these governments on these issues, both privately and public when necessary. And we'll also look to engage societies in ways that we can to be helpful to support those fundamental values and principles.
Well, if they
But-
have a democratically elected government, isn't it quite insulting for us to go in and say, here's how we define it, and we expect you, I mean, people have freedom of speech there, whether it's Hungary or some other countries like Poland that have come under attack. Isn't it somewhat presumptuous of us to go in and then to actually take more of that spend more of that $833 billion that we're spending in deficit to go in to try to help them, push them in certain directions, even though they already have a democratically elected government?
So the second part of my answer, sir, and I appreciate your question, was going to refer to the importance of local context, and that really does matter, especially if you look at the space in Europe right now where we are facing increasing competition, strategic competition from Russia and China. The manner in which we go about upholding our shared values and principles is important. We don't want to ease the space for Russian influence and Chinese influence. We know that Russian disinformation is purporting narratives that are intended to undermine our democracies. So the way in which we go about engaging these governments and supporting these efforts, we want to both be effective, but we also don't want to be seen as inadvertently criticizing.
Maybe the people in these countries, for example, Hungary or elsewhere, when they see us getting involved with trying to push various policies and issues with NGOs, et cetera, in their country, maybe they see it as the same kind of interference that they don't like from Russia.
We certainly need to be careful as we go about supporting these fundamental values, these fundamental principles. We need to be careful that our efforts aren't inadvertently exploited or mischaracterized as an attempt to criticize the democratically elected government of a NATO ally, or we're neither upholding our values or achieving our fundamental national security objectives.
All right, and I've taken a little extra time too, so
And if I could just chime in,
Please
Mr. Chairman,
go
I would
right ahead,
also say
Mr.
that these
Behrman.
countries
Yes.
are asking for our help in terms of building their democracy and transparency. They're actually coming to us and asking for assistance with transparent elections.
Well, that's
This is
true,
And,
and, yeah.
I would also just add that this is a matter of sharing a perspective rather than dictating a policy.
Yeah. Somewhere between Uzbekistan and Hungary, there's one is basically a very sophisticated country, Hungary and Poland and those countries, versus Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which are really developing countries. So there's a line somewhere there for the point that you made of where it becomes interference or where they're actually asking for help and where they're helping them in terms of values and such. Especially disturbing is the fact that we've had so much corruption in various countries that we've helped. I mean, Ukraine, we spent $1 billion in Ukraine, I guess, in the last couple of years, and everybody acknowledges the level of corruption there is just dramatic.
I would just add that we've seen more movement to defeat corruption in the last 4 years than we've seen in the last 20 years. They've just stood up a high-level anti-corruption court, and USAID is helping them stand up that court. We've seen a number of programs that help create transparency with our ProZoro program. And I've visited the East where we actually have created these service centers where people can come in and receive valuable services from their local governments that helps them be more proactive and more responsive.
Well, I will say that at that level, I hope that they are experiencing less corruption. But from what I have been told personally by various groups from Ukraine, that at the highest level, corruption's worse than it's ever been. And that's, I can't verify that, but that's what political groups from that country, whereas we are the committee that oversees our relations with Ukraine, they come to us and they talk to us. And with the one last point, let us just note that sometimes when you have a certain amount of money you're going to spend, and now we have to be much more cautious with it, the spending the money doesn't necessarily bring about the right end. I remember one of the things when I first got here was the Clinton administration's insistence on spending what was the equivalent of $50 million providing fuel for North Korea. And it had just the opposite impact. I mean, the North Koreans thought we were fools for doing that and did not make peace more likely, made it less likely. And this president, with all of his abrasiveness and all of the way that he gets people angry at him, calling the guy the Rocket Man and things like that, we have made tremendous strides forward, at least getting a dialogue going to see if we can improve our relations as compared to what that $50 million got us, which was in a retrenchment of tyranny and threat from North Korea. So with that said, one last point, and then Brad, you can take over. And Brad loves to refute me, but that's okay, you can do that. I think that this administration, I think what's fascinating, I want to go on the record on this, fellas, and that is we have left more career Foreign Service officers in charge of the State Department than any other administration that I've been through in the last 30 years. So we've actually got the pros, like they're with us today. They're all pros. And with that said, that's one thing that you got to take into consideration. Thank you all very much, and Mr. Sherman.
On that last point, I have urged the prior Secretary of State and the current Secretary of State, when they have good people who happen to be career, give them the permanent title. I believe we have at least one acting DAS here, and as good as the people are, you can't do a good job until they tell you it's your job. And I remember the former Secretary of State saying, well, yeah, we haven't filled all these positions because we've got great people filling them temporarily. Permanent is better. As to the issue of if a country is democratic, we shouldn't criticize them. I think that we deal with both democracy and human rights, minority rights, the rule of law. And we need to, just because a country is elected does not mean it's respecting minority rights. That being said, I am concerned at the great popularity in the American press of any color revolution anywhere in Eurasia. We're running out of colors. When it's an attempt to displace a democratically elected government, the U.S. press tends to focus on, well, if a majority of the people in the capital city who are English-speaking and secular are against the government, then obviously it's undemocratic for that government to continue. And the fact is that many of these countries have people who don't live in the capital city and who don't speak English, whose votes ought to be given equal weight. As to the anti-corruption effort, it's good to see that Ukraine has one. I'd point out China has also had a huge anti-corruption effort, which is basically an attempt by President Xi to go after his enemies. And just because a country's doing a lot in anti-corruption does not mean it's primarily an anti-corruption campaign. I want to associate myself with the ranking member's statements and arguments that we should be spending more on foreign aid, but point out that we should also be pushing Europe to do so as well. Now, as a percentage of GDP, they spend more on foreign aid than we do. But we provide the security that they don't provide, as proven even in Europe, where that could not be handled by European military. Kosovo and Bosnia was handled by the U.S. military. As part of our effort to point out that Europe should be spending more on its international obligations, we deliberately undercut that by understating the portion of our GDP that we spend on the military. We spend far more than 4% of our GDP, and then we hide that from the American people by saying, don't include our intelligence operations as part of what we spend on national defense, and don't include VA benefits as part of what we spend on national defense. If any private company excluded from its expenses of product created the pensions that they are going to provide or are obligated to provide, or the pension benefits that they're going to provide their workers, and they didn't list that as one of their expenses, their accountants would go to jail. So we should not be understating what we spend to fool the American people when that undercuts our efforts to get Europe to spend more. I heard a number of the witnesses talk about trade facilitation and the good of expanding trade. Often U.S. companies will come to you and say, go spend money on this. It's trade facilitation and it's supply network improvement. What they're really saying is go spend money so that we can ship jobs overseas and our offshoring will be effective. Is there any regulation at USAID that says that you have to look as to whether a particular project will facilitate offshoring of American jobs?
I can't answer that, but I'm happy to get back to you with it.
Okay, so this is a program, let's break this. It's not a regular, you're the one running the program, and you're not of any, you don't, at least knowingly, carry out a policy of preventing your program to lead to offshoring of jobs.
No, absolutely. In fact, I was just going to mention.
But I mean, it's on your checklist. If a project comes in and the effect is to allow shoes that are made in the United States to be efficiently made in some other country, you don't fund the program?
There's no regulation.
There is no regulation. Is it a policy of yours? So it's not it's. You do not have a policy against funding shipping American jobs overseas. If a project is going to lead to shutting down an American factory, you don't have a policy that says that's a bad idea?
No, in fact, I would just say that we are actually exploiting opportunities for American businesses overseas through our programs.
Okay, when an American business wants you to help exploit the opportunity to close down an American factory and make more money by producing the product overseas, what do?
Well, first off, let me give you a prime example where we're working with a rural company in rural Oklahoma, where we've actually seen an increase in workforce.
I know there are going to be times when your projects lead to increased American employment. I'm asking you a specific question. Do your policies and procedures so when we fund your agency, we may very well, on occasion, be funding a program that makes profits for a great American company by shutting down an American factory and facilitating and doing trade facilitation that helps ship those jobs overseas.
As far as I'm concerned, everything that we're doing is actually in benefit of both American.
But you don't ever, in looking at a project, you don't have on your checklist,
right.
Does this lead to shutting down an American
I'll give
factory?
you an example where that has been the case.
Well, on the one hand, yeah, but you're not, okay. So you would need we'd have to tell you through legislation not to notice whether it leads to shutting down an American factory? I'll ask one of the other witnesses. Are you aware of any State Department policy that says that we're not in favor of trade facilitation projects that increase American corporate profits but decrease American jobs?
I am not aware of any such stated policy, sir. I think
Well,
that the
shouldn't we
goal of-
have one? I mean, you're asking us to go back. We've got this debate between the chairman and the ranking member. You're asking us to go back to our districts and say, spend money on aid, and you don't happen to notice whether you're funding something that's going to shut down American jobs?
I would say it's just the opposite.
Well,
our
do
work-
you have it as part of your I know that you can point to examples where perchance it worked out well, but do you have a written policy against funding a project that you might not, that would displace American jobs?
So When we fund particular projects or particular sectors, sir, we're not looking at the interest of one particular or specific company. Our focus is on typically improving the environment overseas so that our firms can compete.
But are you noticing whether, while hoping that your project might increase jobs, that a project might displace an American factory? Close
No,
it down.
I think what Mr. Bierman is trying to say, we're in fact noticing the opposite. that
I know.
Our projects are actually
Do
doing
you
the
have,
opposite.
let's say you get 10 projects, and 9 of them increase American jobs, and you come here and brag about that. Would you happen to notice that maybe the 10th project led to shutting down an American factory? Do you have a rule against funding that 10th project? The one that would shut down? I know, other than coming here and bragging about the 9 that increase, do you have a policy against funding the project that would lead to closing an American factory?
I don't
Nothing
know.
you can point to.
Hypothetical that we've never
Well, you have no look for it. If it's not part of your job to notice whether you're going to shut down an American factory, I don't expect the foreign government to send you a memo at their expense saying, don't fund this project in our country because it moves jobs from America to Uzbekistan. It's not Uzbekistan's job to protect American jobs, and you won't know what you're doing if you don't look, and you don't have it on your written checklist to look. So I hope that when you come back next year, you will say, yes, we've got a 17-point or 170 points that we look at when we fund a project, and one of them is we're not shutting down an American factory. So come back next year and show it to me. It may be number 169 on the list, but don't tell me to go back to my district and agree with Mr. Meeks and disagree with Mr. Rohrabacher and try to provide more funds for your agency if you won't include this as one of your 170 top concerns. Now let me go to things far less controversial. Although I have gone on pretty long.
Yeah, you have.
I'm closing in on the amount spent done by the chairman. I will sneak in one question if they'll let me.
The answer is yes, but I want to note that the way I handle this as chairman, I usually let people finish their train of thought, and you go right ahead.
Okay.
Just as long as when you're the chairman, I'm going to get that same type of treatment.
Yes, so you're right. Usually chairman gets a little bit more. Mr. Bierman, we've talked here about saving lives. One of your programs that does saving lives is the demining effort in ARTSOC. What are your views on expanding this critical investment in peace by finalizing the Halo Trust's mine clearance funding?
Well, first off, thank you for that question, Congressman. Let me just say, for the record, we've spent $43 million in humanitarian assistance for victims of Nagorno-Karabakh over the last, well, since 1998, over the last 20 years. We are right now at about 97.6% completed the mission of demining in that particular area, and more than 125,000 people have benefited from the demining. This has saved lives and prevents injuries and generates local jobs. So we've continued to support that. We will continue to look at humanitarian assistance in that particular region as it arises.
In a QFR, I'm going to be asking you to urge the Department of Treasury to conclude a tax treaty with Armenia that will help achieve your goals and actually make money for the IRS rather than cost money, which everything else does, and I will yield back.
And I would just, one last additional point would be that I have met with the Armenian diaspora, and we have made a point of reaching out to them and talking about partnerships and benefiting not only Armenia, but the region.
Good, thank you.
We have exactly 5 minutes before the next vote is called, so as a matter of self-interest as well as courtesy, I'm going to have Mr. Meeks say his closing remarks, and then I will close the hearing.
And I will be brief. I just want to thank the four of you for your service and dedication to our great country, and to everybody that works in the State Department and USAID. I've got to tell you, when I travel on this committee, and I go almost any place in the world, First, many times I go and I see our military, our young women and men that's in our United States military. I am so proud of them and what they do and what they stand for and how they do their jobs on an everyday basis. And I've got to tell you, I'm as equally proud of the women and men in the State Department and at USAID. I see them working tirelessly on behalf of our country, working together to make sure that we have a better world. They are dedicated to this great country of ours and for a better world. And I want to make sure that they know that they are truly appreciated by members of the United States Congress. So thank you and thank them for their service.
Good summary, wasn't it? That was terrific. All right, well, let's just know that almost every member of Congress that I know agrees with that assessment. We may be come across as being too much have green eye shades and giving people problems over specifics and trying to make do with the budget that we've got without leaving all of this legacy of debt to our grandchildren. But we know that you're they're the front line, and you're the one who are putting out all the work, and policy, just dictating policy is a lot harder than carrying it out most of the time. So we do appreciate that. Let me just note that I think that there are some fundamental differences that separate us, and I will have to say that some I don't believe, and that we should be in other countries pushing them on policies and philosophies that are, yes, consistent with our values, but if it's a democratically elected government, they can get those values and they can get those decisions from their own people rather than from people who have a culture like we have in California, totally different culture than what's going on in some of the countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or wherever that have a totally different culture than we do. And for us to be pushing, and even in Hungary, even when we push, we're pushing for people to accept us as part of our NGO program to do this. That, I think, is not only a waste of money, but it will create antagonism for us. Helping out to make sure that we help the walnut farmers in Uzbekistan, and if we do, I think that we can they will be grateful to us for doing that, rather than telling us rather than saying, okay, we will agree to your position on gay marriage, okay? And I'm just saying that's the type of thing that we should not be pushing as U.S. policy, but respecting their culture in that way. Otherwise, I think they're going to end up disliking us the same way that people dislike Russia, especially during the Soviet era, when they came in and tried to perpetuate their socialist values on everybody. So with that said, I'm optimistic, and I think we are in line for a better world. I think that technology, your jobs are going to be easier now because technology is, and especially in communications technology, that we are able now to have an influence in another country. And for example, I'm on the science committee, and there's a company, Virgin Galactic, that's just getting into what you call suborbital space. Well, that means we will be able to go to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan in an hour from here. And 10 years from now, there will be an airline doing that, and Virgin Galactic will be offering that service. This is going to have a tremendous impact in the world, and hopefully it will be a positive influence. And we do owe people mind clearing, and I was very happy that that was brought up, because we have, in our history, we have done things to preserve our own security that we need to detail. We need to focus on. Mind clearing is one of them. People in Laos, people in Vietnam, they still have kids who are going out and they are being, their legs blown off or their hands are being blown off. We need to, to me, that is the most justified of all expenditures of foreign aid. because we're rectifying something we created ourselves. And with that said, they're just improving their economy with walnuts, I don't think is enough. But making sure that we help correct, for example, we need to work with people on banking systems that are transparent. I mean, the corruption that I noted in Ukraine, but that's all over the place. What you've got is bankers are now quite often just accomplices to public officials who are looting their own countries. And that's not right. And that's one type of project. It would cost a lot of money for us and a lot of time and expertise to try to help people develop banking systems that will protect their own people from that kind of looting. Those are the type of projects that I think we need more of, and less of the more traditional things that USAID has been doing for the last 50 years. Maybe we're in a new phase, and I think we are, and we're depending on you to get the job done. And thank you for your guidance as we're trying to make the policies of this new phase. So with that said, this subcommittee is adjourned.